Hello everyone, it is great to be able to talk to you through a video camera at least, if not in person. I thank you very much for your patience there. And yeah, I'll give the sound guys a bit of a chance to adjust for my volume because I know I'm a low talker and I'm a lot louder in real life, just not across an amplified system or a video camera system. So hopefully now you can all hear me and I can talk to you about Isaiah 38. Isaiah 38 is one of my favourite chapters. I have to admit, I looked at it last year as part of a devotion time and I just fell in love with it basically. It's so rich and I felt that God was speaking through it to me so powerfully and I really wanted to share it with you guys. So when I asked Peter if I could do that and he said yes, I was really excited. And I hope that you get something out of this as well. Now, having said that, it's a heavy subject material. We are talking about suffering, we're talking about trials and tribulations, and I know that there are people here who are going through really difficult circumstances, and I want to be sensitive in how I basically talk about this material. So I've prayed about this extensively and I hope that the Holy Spirit uses me to provide some kind of comfort today, because there is so much comfort in these verses and I really hope that that comes across. We're basically looking at King Hezekiah. Now, to put a bit of context here, King Hezekiah was back in the the 1 Kings, 2 Kings kind of days of the Old Testament, and he was a good king. They weren't all good back then, but he was a very good king and did the right thing and basically was faithful and a good leader. He had some issues though. At the time of this particular circumstance where he falls ill, he had the king of Assyria basically camped on his doorstep waiting to invade. So it was a stressful time. And in the midst of this, he's got this illness, he's told he's going to die, and he has no heir. He has no son to take up the line. So we all know what happens in cases where there is no direct descendant to take on the kingship. You get a bit of a fight and everybody basically clamours for the leadership position. So Hezekiah was in a very, very dark place for a number of reasons, not just his illness, but his fears for Israel being invaded and not having a strong leader to step into that space. Of course, later on, King Hezekiah would go on to have a son, Manasseh, who was one of the worst kings ever. He was a real bad egg. So in many ways, I'm glad Hezekiah didn't live to see that happen. But at this particular time, he has some great stress going on, and I think that there are some wonderful lessons that we can learn through his writings. So basically we have God saying to Hezekiah through Isaiah the prophet, you are going to die. How Hezekiah takes this news is really important. He turns his face to the wall and he says, "O Lord, remember how I have walked faithfully before you." And then he weeps bitterly. This is not calm acceptance of the news. This is not in accordance with your will, O Lord, I submit my spirit. This is Hezekiah having a really natural human reaction to bad news. Some commentators have also mentioned that Hezekiah is making a reference to the Old Testament covenant when he says, "Remember, Lord, how I have been faithful." So the understanding of God's Old Testament covenant was a little bit misinterpreted sometimes. The Lord had said, if you follow my laws and if you are faithful, I will bless you. And some people have taken that to the extreme of, well, in that case, if I follow God's laws and I do everything right, then that means that basically everything will always go well for me and I will always be blessed and I will always have prosperity. So in a sense here, when Hezekiah says, I have been faithful, remember me, Lord, he may be referring to that Old Testament covenant promise of blessings, but forgetting in the process that that doesn't mean that you're spared from every bad thing that will ever happen. Has something ever happened to you and your first response was, why? What did I do wrong? Or why is this happening? I think this is such a natural thing for us. When something happens that's bad and it's outside of the expectations that we have on our life, it's just outside of the idea of how we thought our life would go, our natural response is to say, Lord, I feel like I've done everything right. I'm doing the best I can. Why has this happened? I don't know if you've experienced this. I know I have. For most of you, you know that I had an injury last year, a fall when I was jogging, and as a result of that I damaged the joints in my jaw, and this is an ongoing injury that I'm still struggling with today and will probably require a second surgery. And yes, I have definitely turned my face to the wall and wept bitterly and said, Lord, why? I have a beautiful friend of mine, the wife of the pastor from my old Harum Scarum youth days when I was a teenager, and she's just the most faithful, wonderful person that you could ever meet. And she's had cancer twice in the space of, I think, about 8 months. And certainly in her case, you could say, why? She has walked faithfully before you, Lord. So I think Hezekiah's response is all of our responses, in a sense. And when we say that Hezekiah wept bitterly, let's be clear what we're talking about here, okay? This is not a few tears, just falling down the face in a lovely little tragic fashion. We are talking about a great weeping. The Hebrew translation for that bitterly is greatly, overwhelmingly. So we are talking one of those cries, if you've ever had them, and I do recommend because they're very cathartic, where you are just bawling your eyes out. You've run out of tissues. You've got snot running down your face and you don't even care anymore because you're that upset. That is the kind of crying that we're talking about here. Hezekiah is letting it all out, but the important thing is he's letting it all out before God. And that is the key to this whole text. He does not push God out of his pain, he does not push God out of his grief, and he does not push God out of this struggle that he's having as to why this is going on. He allows God in, and he respectfully addresses him and says, "Oh Lord." He doesn't forget God as God in the midst of this. He remembers. He says, "Oh Lord," and he weeps and lets it all out. He's having a dark night of the soul. And when we see his later reflections in the subsequent verses where he talks about how his bones were broken and he moaned in pain and his eyes grew weak, this illness, whatever he was going through, was not an easy thing. And at one point in his later reflections, he says, in the midst of this, I said, I am being threatened. Lord, come to my aid. He cries out to God, and God hears him. So here we have God's answer to Hezekiah, and it's just a beautiful verse that I want us to sit with in this space for a little while. It's verse 4, where God says to Hezekiah, I have heard your prayer and seen your tears. Let's pause on the second part of this for just a moment. God has heard Hezekiah's prayer, but he also says, I have seen your tears. He sees Hezekiah's pain. I don't know if you remember, but once upon a time, there was a lady called Hagar. She was a maidservant of Sarah back in Abraham's day. There was a whole big cuffaloo kind of thing going on, and she ran away because the situation was not going well. And God made her a promise and appeared to her in her most desperate moment. And as a result of that, she said, God, I'm going to call you El Roi, which means the one who sees. She called God the one who sees. And here with Hezekiah, God says, I have seen your tears. there is something so important to us as humans. We want to be seen when we are experiencing pain, when we are having a difficult time. Think about this in terms of what happens when something goes wrong or bad in your day. You grab someone and you vent, right? Like, it doesn't matter who it is sometimes. It doesn't have to necessarily be your nearest and dearest. It could be a neighbor or a cousin's third removed nephew. You just want to talk. You want to let it all out and say, this is what happened. This is how I felt. And this is why it was wrong. And this is what I wish would have happened. Why do we do that? Why is it so important for us to just tell everything to somebody else? What are we looking for in that moment? We're not necessarily looking for someone to fix the situation. Often the situation can't be fixed. No, we're looking for someone to show that they've seen us. When you pour out your heart to someone and they look you dead in the eye and they go, man, that is hard. I understand why you feel that way. I would have reacted that way too. We feel seen, we feel heard, we feel understood. And here is the best news that we can take out of this verse. God sees us, but he sees us in a way that no other human can, right? So yes, your spouse, your friend, your mum or dad, they might see you and hear you and empathize with you. But we have a God who has suffered greatly. We have Jesus who went to the cross, who knew what it was like to lose friends, to be betrayed, who knew what it was like basically to live homeless and travel around from town to town and have all sorts of deprivations that come along with that. We have a God who has experienced everything in that human suffering kind of life, that looks at us and says, I see you, I see your tears, I care. And that matters. That matters so much. So it's important, I think, for us to reflect on this, because Hezekiah does get an answer to prayer, right? God says, yes, I'm going to heal you. I'm adding 15 years to your life. And for some of you who are praying at the moment in a difficult time, you may not have experienced that answer yet. But don't lose sight of the fact that you still have a God who sees you, and you still have a God that cares deeply about you. Also, let's put Hezekiah's, healing in perspective. He was healed of this particular illness, yes, and that was great, and he was given 15 more years. But then in 15 years' time, he is going to die of something else. So in our lifetime, we have ups and we have downs. We have trials and we have good times. And sometimes those things overlap. So the only guarantee that we have is that in this world we will have trouble, as the Lord Jesus said. But take heart. Jesus says, I have overcome the world. So yes, Hezekiah received what he asked for and what he prayed for. But that doesn't mean that the rest of his life is also going to be smooth sailing. But take comfort, whatever we're going through, whatever trial, whatever tribulation, God sees you. I wanted to conclude today by looking at some of the reflections that Hezekiah wrote down when he had been healed of his illness. Looking back, lessons basically that he's learned through his suffering. There are some incredibly profound statements here, so we'll just spend some time unpacking them. The first one that he makes is in verse 15, where he says, but what can I say? He, referring to God, has spoken to me, and he himself has done this. So here Hezekiah is actually saying, what can I say about this situation or about everything that happened? God spoke to me, and God himself has done this. Done the healing, yes, but also this is a reference to the fact that God permitted or allowed this period of suffering in Hezekiah's life. You may recall that Job made similar statements when he was reflecting and pouring out his heart. He is acknowledging that God is sovereign. And whilst God hates evil and does not do evil himself, he does allow or permit evil because he is all-powerful and he is in control. And that's probably one of the hardest things to come to terms with sometimes in difficult circumstances, is that God could stop, could help or rescue sooner. And for whatever purposes and plans and reasons has allowed a situation to unfold. That is incredibly hard sometimes to wrap our heads around. We know and we take comfort that what Satan intends for evil, God will ultimately work for the good. But when you're in the midst of that evil circumstance, it is very, very difficult to look at the sovereignty of God sometimes and to realize and understand that his ways are not our ways. So Hezekiah acknowledges God is sovereign in this situation. And then he says, I will walk humbly all the years of my life because of this anguish of my soul. There is something about difficult times, pain or losing a loved one or severe financial stress, whatever the situation may be. There's something about it that really humbles you in a way that perhaps no other thing can. You are face to face, I guess, with the fact that you're not in control, or you're not as in control as you would like to think over your life, over circumstances, and quite frankly, that can be terrifying. We need to believe deep down, I think, that we can control more things than what we can actually control. We like to think deep down that if we do X, then Y will happen. And when that's not the case, it pulls us up short. And we're suddenly confronted with the realization that there is just so much beyond our ability to control. But whereas this is a very terrifying aspect, if you're a non-believer, if you're someone that doesn't believe in a sovereign or loving God, we do believe in a sovereign and loving God. And this is where the sovereignty of God is actually a comfort. So before I said sometimes it's really hard for us to wrap our heads around why God might permit or allow a particular circumstance to happen. But ultimately what is a comfort is that we do have a God who is in control. There isn't a situation here where God is wringing his hands and saying, oh no, what am I going to do? And we also have a God who loves us. If we had a God that was in control, but that didn't really care, or was just kind of meh, you do you and I'll just be up on high and not worry about things, that would be truly, truly terrifying. But because we have a God that loves us so deeply, who gave his son to die on the cross for us, because we have that assurance of his love and his care, then the fact that he's ultimately in control as well is something we can rest on. So instead of us going, I've got it together, I've got it under control, it's all okay, we can actually go, no, you know what, I don't have it together, I don't have it all under control, but I have a loving God who does, and that's why ultimately I will put my trust in that, and I will put my faith in that. And that's humbling. I think sometimes for me, what I find humbling is how I'm not as resilient as I think. Deep down sometimes, I think I'd like to look at myself as coping with all situations and circumstances with, unshakable faith and just taking it all in my stride and being one of those really calm people that just never flaps. But I'm not, and I can't sit here today and pretend that I am. Throughout this particular injury, I have struggled. I have railed against God and said why I have not handled it well. And in those moments, it's been humbling. It's been a way of me going, you know what, Lord, I do need you. I need your strength. I can't do this myself. I am not as strong as I like to think I am. And I think maybe that's what Hezekiah means when he says in verse 16, Lord, by such things people live, and my spirit finds life in them too. So he's talking about this humbling and this anguish that he had with his illness. And he's saying, by such things people live, and my spirit finds life in them too. And it reminded me very much of what Paul said when Paul had a thorn in his flesh. We don't know what that was. There's a lot of conjecture and ideas thrown around whether it was an illness or something else. But we do know that for Paul, it was really difficult and impeding his life, and he pleaded with God 3 times to take away this trial, whatever it was. But God said to Paul that he wasn't basically going to take it away, because his strength, God's strength, was made perfect in weakness, and God's grace was sufficient for Paul. So Paul said, you know what? In that case, I will boast about my weakness, because when I am weak, then I am strong. This is very upside down thinking. Okay, this is definitely not the thinking we have in the secular world, right? Everything in the New Age kind of belief department is about how to empower yourself and strengthen yourself, and how you can do it, and how everything's going to be okay because you are the one that is going to be able to be strong enough. Whereas what we have in this upside down kingdom culture of God is we come with our weakness. We say we are weak, and God's strength is sufficient for us in that. And so when Hezekiah says, I'm finding life in this, I think it's because that's where he is experiencing Jesus in the deepest, most profound way. He is experiencing God in the midst of that anguish of soul, because it's often in our most broken moments that's where we learn more about God. That's where we truly understand what he's like. That's where he comes through for us when we have just given up, or we're overwhelmed, or we didn't think we could go on. And that's where we find God. When we reach the end of ourselves, that's where we really find God. And we realize that his strength is sufficient, that he is with us. I think the worst expression that we have in general culture is when we say God is on high looking down. No, that is not the God of the Bible. We have Emmanuel, God with us. He is right here in the room. He is with us now today. We do not have a God who is separate and looking down from up high. We have a God who is with us as we grapple and as we experience pain, and who is helping us and strengthening us and helping us to get to the end of whatever trial or circumstance that we have. And I believe that deeply. And that is our comfort. That is our assurance. And that is why we can say, yes, my spirit finds life in this, because God is here, and God is life, and God is light. And we will get through the darkness because of that. Hezekiah says something then, which, you don't get to this place until you've really learned some very deep things. He says, surely it was for my benefit that I suffered such anguish. That is a statement that is probably easier to make at the end of a particular trial than it is to make in the middle or at the beginning of it. So we say, and we quote Romans 8, we say, well, God works all things to the good of those who love him. And we know that ultimately God will work something good through every painful circumstance. But sometimes when you're in the middle of that, you don't have the benefit of hindsight. And so the challenge, I guess, for all of us is, if you are in the middle of something or the beginning of something at the moment, it's about taking the time and the opportunity to see the hand of God at work still, to see the little blessings of God in the midst of that. And that is hard. It's training your eye and it's training your ear almost to just pay attention to things when everything in your circumstance might be clamoring at you to pay attention to that. When you're going through something hard, all you really can do sometimes is focus on that hard thing. And it is hard to keep pulling your attention back to, all right, but what is God doing here? How have I seen God at work in today? When I laughed with a friend, when I had a hug from my mum, when I patted a dog, these are such little things, but they're little moments of joy. They're little moments of blessing. If you can train yourself to look for them, if you can train your eye to still see God at work in the midst of what's going on, I think it adds such a deep joy in you that God is with you and God is at work. And so you don't have to wait till the end to, I guess, have that big hindsight moment of, right, I can see how God was at work. You can start to see how He's at work in the little ways in the middle. And there is value in that. So I'll say it again, you don't have to wait to the end to see and experience the moments of God, the joy of coming to Him in Scripture and praying to Him and knowing that He sees you and is loving you and revealing more of His character to you. And that's my prayer for everyone here today, that we would see and experience God more and more in the little things of life as well as the big things, in the middle of our trials as well as at the end.